Her hand was already on his armrest, before he had even set down his coffee. Julian Marsh had flown incognito on his own airline 11 times in the last 2 years, and not once had anyone tried to physically move him out of a seat before the boarding door had even closed. Until 6:58 a.m. on a Wednesday. Until a woman named Constance Ridgway decided a black man in a faded flannel shirt did not belong in seat 2A. 12 minutes later, Beacon Air's own internal alert system, a system almost nobody at the company knew existed, would quietly notify 3 senior executives that their anonymous quality inspection flight had just gone very wrong. 4 minutes after that, the purser standing in that aisle would learn exactly whose airline he worked for. Nobody sitting in that cabin knew any of it yet. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. Julian Marsh's morning had started the way it always did on inspection weeks, quietly, deliberately, without a single detail that would separate him from any other tired traveler moving through a Wednesday. He woke at 4:30 a.m. in a plain airport hotel room he had booked himself, under his own name but with no note anywhere in the reservation system connecting it to Beacon Air's corporate account. He made 1 cup of coffee from the small in-room machine, black, and ate a granola bar standing at the window, watching the runway lights blink against a still dark sky. He packed his own bag. He always packed his own bag, even now, 9 years after founding the airline, whose name was painted in blue letters on the tail of the aircraft he was about to board. It took him 8 minutes, the same 8 minutes it had taken since he was 25 years old, and flying coach to investor meetings he could barely afford the ticket for. There was a kind of discipline in keeping a routine that had never needed to grow with the size of the company. At the hotel that morning, the front desk clerk offered to call a car for him, the kind reserved for guests staying in the hotel's higher categories. Julian thanked her and walked to the shuttle stop instead, his backpack over one shoulder, a single gray duffel bag in his hand, with a frayed strap he had never gotten around to replacing. When the shuttle driver reached for the bag, Julian lifted it into the rack himself, before the man's hand got there. He did not need anyone to know who he was. That was, in fact, the entire point of this particular Wednesday. 9 years earlier, Julian had started Beacon Air with 4 leased regional jets and a promise to himself that the airline would never become the kind of company that treated its passengers differently depending on how they looked walking down the aisle. Twice a year, unannounced, he flew a handful of Beacon's own routes anonymously, seated in whatever class the flight happened to have available that day, watching how his employees actually behaved when they believed no one important was paying attention. Only 3 people at the company knew this practice existed at all, and even they did not know which flights he would choose or when. He had grown up watching his own father, a machinist who took the earliest bus to work every morning for 30 years, get talked over in stores, and waved past in offices by people who assumed, from a glance, that his time and his money mattered less than theirs. Julian had promised himself, long before he understood how to build an airline, that if he ever had the standing to change how those rooms worked, he would use it plainly, by watching closely, rather than announcing loudly. The incognito flights were not a stunt for investors or a marketing story waiting to be told. They were, in a real sense, the only part of running Beacon Air that still felt like the reason he had started it. His phone had buzzed 6 times before he reached security. 2 calls from Sandra Kwan, his chief operating officer, about an entirely unrelated fuel contract renewal. 1 from Dominic Reyes, his general counsel, flagging a routine regulatory filing. 1 text from Talia Whitcomb, his assistant of 3 weeks, marked urgent, about a board vote scheduled for that afternoon. He silenced the phone and slid it into his coat pocket without reading past the first line. Whatever it was, could wait until he landed. It usually could, until the day it couldn't. He wore a faded gray flannel shirt over a plain white undershirt, the same shirt he had worn on half of his incognito flights that year, a small tear near the elbow he had never bothered to mention to anyone. His duffel bag was 7 years old, the strap held together with a loop of black electrical tape rather than replaced, because he had never seen the point of an object announcing something the airline's own performance should demonstrate instead. Nothing about him signaled the number that sat quietly in a filing 3 floors above Beacon Air's headquarters in Miami, 44 years old, founder and sole controlling shareholder, and for the last 9 years, chief executive officer of the very airline whose gate agent, 20 minutes earlier, had checked his boarding pass without once looking up at his face. At security, a TSA officer glanced twice between his boarding pass and his flannel shirt, the way officers sometimes do when a business class ticket does not match the clothing standing in front of them. Neither of them said anything about it. It happened often enough on these inspection flights that Julian had stopped noticing the exact moment, only the faint aftertaste had left, familiar in a way he had come to expect, and, in a strange sense, to value, because it told him exactly what an ordinary passenger without his name attached to it might experience on any given morning. Gate 14 at Miami International Airport smelled the way every gate in the world smells: recycled air, machine coffee, the particular sourness of industrial carpet cleaner that never fully leaves. The departure board above the counter read, Beacon 118 Miami to Chicago, boarding 7:05 a.m., and beneath it, 71 passengers sat in the kind of half-attention that comes an hour before dawn has finished arriving. Constance Ridgway walked through the gate area the way certain frequent flyers walk through gate areas, unhurried, chin raised slightly, a cream designer blazer catching the fluorescent light, a Beacon Air Summit tag, the airline's top loyalty tier, clipped visibly to the strap of her carry-on. She had flown this exact route for years, twice a month, ever since her company opened a satellite office in Chicago, and she had never once been asked to prove she belonged in the seat she considered, in some unspoken way, permanently hers. 10 minutes earlier, a passenger with a young child had been struggling to find overhead space for a car seat, and flight attendant Renee Castillo had stepped in without being asked, rearranged 2 bins herself, and carried the car seat down the aisle so the mother could settle the toddler first. It was the kind of small competence that made passengers trust her, the kind that had earned her 2 customer commendation letters in 6 years. It was also the kind of moment that made what came next so much harder to explain. Douglas Fenn had worked as a purser for 14 years, the last 6 of them on Beacon's premium routes, and had built a reputation among senior crew as someone who kept flights moving no matter what friction appeared at the gate. He believed, in the plain way people believe things they have never had reason to examine, that a smooth departure mattered more than a slow, correct one, and that a passenger's calm demeanor was usually a reliable signal of who was actually in the right. He was, by every ordinary measure, a capable and well-regarded employee, having an unremarkable Wednesday, making a call he did not consider a real decision at all. 2 rows back near the boarding counter, a pair of college students waiting for a later connection were half watching the gate the way travelers do when there is nothing else to look at. Something's going on up there, one of them murmured to the other, nodding toward the growing cluster near the jet bridge. Neither of them thought much of it. It was, to them, exactly the kind of small friction that happens in airports 50 times a day and is forgotten by lunch. They had no way of knowing they were about to overhear the opening minutes of the most consequential morning Beacon Air would have all year. The gate closed for boarding in 16 minutes. Julian had boarded during the first group, walked down the narrow business class aisle, and settled into seat 2A, his duffel bag beneath the seat in front of him, a paperback open on his tray table. Constance arrived 4 minutes later, glanced at the seat, and stopped in the aisle beside him. "That's my seat," she said. Her voice carried the particular certainty of someone who had never once needed to check a boarding pass before saying so out loud. Julian looked up, closed his book without marking the page, and answered evenly. "I believe this is 2A, he said. "My boarding pass has me here." He held it toward her, not pushing it into her hands, simply offering it to be seen. Constance did not reach for it. Her eyes moved over him once, from his sneakers to his flannel shirt, before she answered. "There must be some mistake," she said. "I've flown this route for years. This is always my seat. I don't recall ever seeing you on this flight before." "That may be," Julian said, "but this is the seat printed on my boarding pass, issued this morning, for this flight. If there's a system error, I'm happy to have someone confirm it, but I don't think either of us should assume based on memory alone." That was the moment the assumption hardened into a decision. Constance had made it in the first 3 seconds, the moment she saw him, a man in a worn flannel shirt with a duffel bag, no visible status signals, sitting in a business-class seat she considered, in some unspoken way, an extension of her own reserved territory. She had not examined that assumption, she had simply acted on it, the same way she had acted on similar assumptions before on this exact route, most of them never tested, most of them never noticed by anyone at all. A man in seat 1C lowered his newspaper an inch and did not lower it further. A young woman in row 3, headphones around her neck, watched the exchange without moving, her hand hovering near her phone and never quite lifting it. An older man across the aisle in 2C, a retired Army veteran named Harold Mays, set down his crossword puzzle entirely and watched with open, uncomfortable attention. 3 passengers, 3 separate kinds of silence. Julian did not raise his voice. "I understand you've flown this route often," he said. "But that doesn't change what my boarding pass says today. I'd ask that we simply confirm it with the crew rather than assume." "Get lost," Constance said, her voice rising just enough that the first 2 rows turned. "I paid for this cabin. I'm not moving for someone who clearly wandered up here from economy." Harold Mays, in seat 2C, made a small sound of disbelief that he immediately tried to disguise as a cough. Julian's expression did not change. "I didn't wander anywhere," he said. "I boarded with a valid boarding pass, the same as you." "I've flown this airline for 15 years, Constance said, her tone sharpening further. "I know how this cabin works better than some new hire scanning tickets at the door." Julian did not answer that directly. 15 years is a long time, he said instead. "I'd hope in that time you've also learned that a boarding pass settles a seat assignment faster than either of our memories will." Constance's mouth tightened. "Are you actually going to argue with me over this?" she said. Julian met her eyes. "I'm not arguing," he said. "I'm stating what's printed on this pass and asking that someone confirm it. That isn't the same thing." A flight attendant nearby, hearing the rise in tone, turned her head. Renee Castillo stepped closer, her posture professional, her voice pitched to sound reassuring before she had gathered a single fact. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Constance answered before Julian could speak. "Yes, there is," she said. "This man is in my seat and refusing to move. I've flown this exact seat for years. Everyone on this crew usually knows that." Renee's eyes flicked between them, uncertain, and then toward the aisle where the purser, a heavyset man named Douglas Fenn, was making his way forward from the galley, drawn by the rising volume. "What seems to be the issue?" Douglas asked, arriving with the brisk authority of a man who had resolved 100 seating disputes, and assumed, before hearing a single detail, that he understood the shape of this one already. "Sir, madam, please," Renee said, glancing nervously between them. "Let me just check the manifest again." She tapped at her handheld scanner, frowning slightly at what appeared on the screen, then looked up, uncertain, toward Douglas rather than announcing what she'd found. Douglas did not wait for her to finish. "Ma'am," he said to Constance, "if you'll just take your seat, I'll get this gentleman relocated so we can get moving." It was, in its own small way, an answer offered before the question had actually been settled. A decision made the same way Constance's own assumption had been made, in the first 3 seconds, based on nothing more than who was standing and who was already seated with an air of belonging. "I have the boarding pass for seat 2A, Julian said, holding it out again, this time toward Douglas directly. "You are welcome to check it against the manifest before deciding anything." Douglas glanced at it for exactly as long as it took to confirm he had seen it, without appearing to actually read it. "Sir," he said, "I don't have time to relitigate this before pushback. Miss S. Ridgway has flown this route for 15 years. I trust her memory of her own seat assignment." Pause. Julian looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, not with pleading, simply looking, and said one sentence that meant nothing to Douglas in that instant and would mean everything in 12 minutes. "You may want to check that manifest more carefully before this flight leaves the gate." Then he sat back in his seat, his boarding pass still resting on the tray table where anyone could see it. Renee, still holding her scanner, glanced down at the screen once more, her frown deepening. "Douglas," she said quietly, "my screen's actually showing seat 2A under a different reservation than Miss S. Ridgway's ticket. It might just be a system sync issue." Douglas did not look at her. "Run it again, in 10 minutes if you want," he said. I don't have 10 minutes. It was the first small crack in the morning, a junior colleague offering a fact that contradicted him, and a purser choosing certainty over verification. Renee hesitated, glanced once at Julian, and stepped back toward the galley without saying anything further. Constance folded her arms, satisfied, and remained standing in the aisle rather than moving to any other seat, as though the matter would resolve itself simply by her continuing to occupy the space between rows. This is ridiculous, she muttered, loud enough for the first 4 rows to hear. Some people just don't understand how these things work. The sound of the boarding scanner near the door gave its short, conclusive beep as another passenger stepped through, a sound that, on any other morning, meant nothing at all. While Douglas was still deciding what to do next, satisfied he had at least attempted a resolution, a small internal system deep within Beacon Air's reservation infrastructure, one built quietly 2 years earlier and known to almost no one outside a handful of executives, registered the presence of a specific reservation code on Flight 118 and generated a single, silent alert, routed automatically to 3 phones at Beacon Air's Miami headquarters. Nobody on the aircraft knew this system existed. Nobody standing in that aisle had any reason to look for it. In the terminal outside the jet bridge, unseen by anyone in row 2, Julian's phone buzzed once more against his hip, and this time he glanced down at it briefly, silenced it again without reading it, and slid it back into his coat. 7 missed calls now sat beneath the dark glass, and he still had not turned it over. 3 floors above the gate, inside Beacon Air's Corporate Operations Center, Sandra Kwan, the Chief Operating Officer, was midway through an entirely unrelated fuel contract meeting when her phone buzzed with a notification she had not seen in over a year. Shadow flag active, Flight 118, Gate 14, unresolved cabin disturbance. She stopped mid-sentence. What is it? Asked Dominic Reyes, the general counsel, seated across the table. Sandra turned her screen toward him without a word. Dominic read it twice. Is that what I think it is? He asked. Sandra nodded slowly. It means Julian is on that flight, and something is already wrong. There was a second complication in the room that nobody had said aloud yet. A board member named Preston Yoder, who had spent the last 2 quarters pushing for staffing reductions on regional routes to improve margins ahead of the airline's public offering, cleared his throat from the far end of the table. If this is an inspection flight gone sideways, he said, I'd like it noted for the record that crew training and staffing levels have been a known risk area, one I raised concerns about at the last 2 board meetings. It was not quite an accusation aimed at himself. It was close enough that Sandra did not bother responding to it directly. We're not discussing staffing policy in the middle of an active incident, Sandra said, already standing and reaching for her jacket. Dominic, get someone to that gate immediately, quietly, before this becomes something we can't walk back. The room's newest employee, an assistant named Talia Whitcomb, who had been with Beacon Air for 3 weeks, looked up from her laptop where she had been monitoring the same alert dashboard as part of her onboarding. I can see the gate log, she said quietly. It's showing an unresolved seating dispute, flagged 9 minutes ago. There's also a note that a flight attendant queried the manifest and got overridden by the purser on duty. Preston Yoder let out a short, humorless sound. You're telling me our own CEO might currently be standing in the middle of exactly the kind of cabin failure we've been telling shareholders our new customer experience initiative would prevent, he said, as though the coincidence itself proved something he had suspected all along, though he could not have said what. While Talia was still scrolling through the log, quietly, almost apologetically, someone else at the table had already pulled up the passenger manifest on a second screen and stopped. Talia's right, she said. Seat 2A, reservation under J. Marsh, flagged as disputed. Purser on record is Douglas Fenn. The room went quiet in a different way than it had a moment earlier, not confused now, but bracing. A second, smaller problem surfaced almost immediately behind the first. Beacon Air's head of communications, a woman named Renata Ojo, who had joined the call a few minutes late, looked up from her own phone with a different kind of concern. Someone in the gate area posted a short clip online, she said. 11 seconds, audio mostly, someone telling a passenger to get lost over a seat. It's on a small account right now, barely any views. But if this becomes a story before we've resolved it internally, we're not managing a seating dispute anymore. We're managing a headline about our own airline treating a passenger this way, and we won't get to control which passenger the story turns out to be about. She said it flatly, the way professionals say the worst-case version of a problem out loud, specifically so the room stops pretending it isn't possible. Preston Yoder, who had been quiet since his last remark, seized on this with the particular energy of someone relieved to find fault somewhere other than himself. Which is exactly the kind of exposure I flagged when I raised concerns about crew workload, he said. If we'd invested in proper staffing instead of... Preston. Sandra's voice was not loud, but it ended the sentence anyway. We can have this conversation after we've fixed it. Right now I need everyone focused on getting to that gate, and I need Renata drafting a response we hope we never have to use. Nobody in the room disagreed with her, including, after a beat, Preston himself. Sandra was already 3 steps toward the door. Dominic, phone in hand, was calling the gate operations line directly rather than waiting on the general channel. Talia, laptop still open, followed without being asked, and nobody stopped her. Back at the gate, Douglas was midway through a second attempt to persuade Julian to accept a different seat when Sandra Kwan appeared at the top of the jet bridge, moving with the particular urgency of someone who has just left a meeting mid-sentence for the first time in years. She had been Beacon Air's chief operating officer for 6 years, and had never once been called down to a gate this fast for a seating dispute, because she had never before had a reason to know one of these disputes might involve the person who had hired her. Douglas, she said, cutting in before he could finish his sentence to Julian. What's the passenger's name in 2A? Douglas blinked. Marsh, he said, J. Marsh. Sandra looked at Julian directly for the first time, studying him the way people study someone they have just been told, in a hallway, in a voice they had never heard a colleague use before, is not who anyone in this jet bridge currently believes him to be. Mr. Marsh, she said, I'm so sorry for the confusion this morning. Constance's mouth opened slightly, sensing, before she understood why, that the ground beneath her had just shifted. Julian looked at Sandra with the same measured calm he had held for the last 12 minutes. I appreciate you coming down, he said, but I'd like this handled the way it should have been handled from the start. Someone actually checked the manifest and found the answer 9 minutes ago. Nobody acted on it. Sandra turned to Douglas without hesitation. I need you to step away from this row immediately, she said, her voice carrying a new firmness it had not had a minute earlier. Douglas's face went through confusion, then something closer to dread. Is this about the seat? He asked, his voice thinning. I was just trying to keep things moving. Sandra did not soften the answer. It's about the fact that your own flight attendant flagged a manifest discrepancy 9 minutes ago, and you told her to run it again later rather than check it, she said. That's the part that matters most, regardless of who is sitting in that seat. But since you're asking, the passenger you were trying to move is Julian Marsh. He founded this airline. He's the reason any of us have a job to be careless with this morning. Douglas's face drained of color in a way that had nothing to do with the cabin's air conditioning. Renee Castillo, standing near the galley, pressed a hand briefly against the counter, steadying herself against a piece of information she had not expected to receive standing in an aircraft aisle. Renee, Sandra continued gently, you tried to correct this. I saw the log. That matters, and it will be part of how this is reviewed. Renee nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Constance Ridgway, still standing in the aisle, had gone very still. I didn't know who he was, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Sandra's expression did not soften. Ma'am, she said, that was never supposed to be the reason it mattered. Those 7 words landed harder than anything else said that morning. Constance had no answer for them, because there wasn't one. The problem had never been that she failed to recognize wealth or ownership sitting 2 feet away from her in a worn flannel shirt. The problem was that she had assumed, instantly and without evidence, that a man dressed the way Julian was dressed did not belong in the seat his own ticket confirmed. And she would have made that exact same assumption whether the man turned out to be the founder of the airline or a warehouse worker flying home to see his family, because the assumption had never had anything to do with facts in the first place. Sandra stepped back into the jet bridge briefly to take a call from Beacon Air's own general counsel, Dominic Reyes, coordinating in real time. Pull Douglas from the gate, Dominic said. Sandra hesitated only a moment. "We can resolve this quietly," she said. "He's already agreed to have Constance seated. We can depart within 10 minutes. "That's not the problem we're solving," Dominic said. "We have a documented incident where our own flight attendant flagged a manifest error correctly and was overruled by a purser who chose certainty over 5 extra minutes of verification, resulting in our own CEO nearly being removed from a seat on his own airline. If this crew finishes this flight like nothing happened, and this clip keeps circulating, the story becomes that Beacon Air's leadership let it slide because fixing it got inconvenient. I want Douglas Fenn off this aircraft before pushback. I want a full review opened within the hour." Sandra found Douglas near the forward galley, still holding his laminated clipboard, still under the impression that the morning was proceeding toward some kind of workable outcome. "Douglas," she said, "I need you to gather your things and step off the aircraft." He blinked. "Is this about the seat thing?" he asked, his voice carrying the particular disbelief of a man who has genuinely not yet understood the size of what has happened. Sandra did not soften the answer. "It's about the fact that Renee flagged a manifest discrepancy 9 minutes before you overruled her, and you never once checked it yourself," she said. "That would have been true regardless of who was sitting in 2A. The fact that it happens to be Julian Marsh only means the company found out about it in real time, instead of 3 weeks from now, in a customer complaint file." Douglas's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, then something closer to recognition. "I thought I was just keeping the flight on schedule," he said quietly. "That's exactly the problem," Sandra said. "You weren't keeping anything on schedule. You were deciding, in about 4 seconds standing at that row, whose word mattered more, and you decided it without ever looking at the screen your own colleague was holding up to you." He did not argue further. He gathered his clipboard, his jacket, and followed a ground supervisor down the jet bridge, his badge already deactivated by the time he reached the door. Captain Alan Whitfield, informed of the situation by Sandra directly, stepped out of the cockpit briefly before departure. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "I want you to know I take full responsibility for anything that happens on this aircraft, including this morning's misjudgment by my crew. I should have been informed the moment a flagged manifest discrepancy went unresolved, rather than learning about it after headquarters called down." Julian nodded once. "I appreciate you saying that directly," he said. Renee Castillo approached the row a few minutes later, her hands slightly unsteady. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I want you to know I did try to flag it, quietly, before it went as far as it did. I should have pushed harder." Julian looked at her for a long moment. "I noticed you tried," he said. "That matters, even if it didn't change what happened in the moment. It's exactly the instinct I'd want every one of our flight attendants to have." The flight eventually departed 21 minutes behind schedule. Captain Whitfield at the controls, Renee Castillo working the cabin with visibly more confidence than she had at the start of the morning, and Constance Ridgway seated, at her own quiet request, in an economy seat near the back, rather than anywhere near business class at all. Preston Yoder's afternoon board vote on staffing reductions was quietly postponed that same day, not formally connected to the morning's events in any official record, but Sandra made certain, in a private conversation before the rescheduled meeting, that every director understood exactly what 9 unfilled minutes of proper verification had nearly cost the company, and exactly how thin the staffing on regional routes had become in the 2 years since Preston's cost-cutting proposals had started winning quiet support. The staffing reduction proposal did not return to a vote for the remainder of that fiscal year. The consequence for Douglas Fenn arrived within the hour, delivered by Dominic Reyes himself after reviewing the gate recording, 3 passenger statements, and Renee Castillo's own account of being overruled. Douglas was terminated that same afternoon, 14 years with the airline ending in a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. He did not appeal the decision. He had spent the walk off the jet bridge already arriving, on his own, at roughly the same conclusion Sandra had reached in the aisle. Renee Castillo's case was reviewed the same week, and rather than any disciplinary action, she was invited to join Beacon Air's new Customer Experience Advisory Committee, a small group of frontline employees given a direct line to senior leadership specifically because Renee had demonstrated, under pressure, the exact instinct the company claimed to want in every one of its crew members. She accepted, somewhat uncertainly, and would go on to help redesign the very manifest verification procedure that had failed that morning. Constance Ridgway's summit status was quietly reviewed as part of the same internal process. She was not banned from the airline, but her account was flagged for a documented pattern of assuming seating priority based on travel history rather than confirmed assignment, a pattern 2 other passenger complaints over the preceding 18 months had noted but never fully investigated until this particular Wednesday forced the airline to look. She wrote a short letter to Beacon Air's customer relations office 2 weeks later. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement, careful and detailed, of a habit she said she had never once examined until she watched it fail in front of a full cabin. Talia Whitcomb, the assistant who had pulled up the manifest confirmation before anyone else in the room understood its significance, received a short note from Julian's office the following week, unsigned by name but clearly from him, thanking her for connecting a detail everyone else had been ready to dismiss in the first 30 seconds of confusion. It was not a promotion, it was not a bonus. It was simply an acknowledgement that someone had tried to follow a fact to its consequence when it would have been easier to stay quiet, and that the attempt had been noticed. She kept the note in her desk drawer for the rest of the year. 3 weeks later, Julian boarded a Beacon flight again, incognito as always, a different route entirely, and found Harold Mays, the retired Army veteran from C2C, seated 2 rows behind him by pure coincidence. Harold caught his eye as he passed and gave a small nod, the kind given to someone you recognize without needing to explain why. Julian returned it, and neither of them said a word, because the nod had been enough for both of them. Harold had thought about that morning more than he expected to. In the weeks since, he was not a man who spoke up often in public, and the fact that he hadn't, not really until the very end when Sandra Kwan arrived, had sat with him longer than he liked to admit. He wrote a short letter of his own to Beacon Air's customer relations office, not a complaint, but an account, careful and detailed, of what he had seen and what he wished he had said sooner. He mentioned, near the end of it, that 30 years in the Army had taught him plenty about chains of command, but almost nothing about when silence in a first-class aisle was its own kind of failure. He hoped, he wrote, to do better the next time he found himself sitting close enough to matter. The young woman from row 3, whose name was Denise Alvarez and who worked as a paralegal in Chicago, had watched the entire exchange with her hand hovering over her phone the whole time, never quite lifting it to record. She thought about that hesitation for days afterward, turning it over the way people do when they realize, too late, that the moment for a small courage had already passed. She resolved that the next time she found herself standing near an injustice too small to seem worth documenting, she would document it anyway. 6 weeks after the incident, Beacon Air quietly updated its internal seating dispute policy to require that any flagged manifest discrepancy be resolved and confirmed before boarding could proceed, rather than deferred, to be checked again later, at a purser's discretion. The policy would eventually be referred to inside the company, informally and without any official name attached to it, simply as the 9-minute rule. Nobody outside a small group of executives ever connected it publicly to what had happened at Gate 14 that Wednesday morning. Julian never asked for his name to be attached to it. He had never needed anyone to know who he was. The work always made that clear eventually. Sandra Kwan mentioned the incident only once more, months later, during a leadership meeting on customer experience reform, and said that the hardest part of that Wednesday had never been the phone call to remove a purser with 14 years of service. The hardest part had been realizing that Beacon Air's own systems had flagged the manifest correction 9 minutes before anyone acted on it, and that the gap between the flag and the fix had been filled entirely by a man in a worn flannel shirt, deciding, quietly, to hold his ground rather than disappear into another seat, the way an unknown number of other passengers, over the prior 2 years, quietly had. She had pulled the complaint records herself once the review began. None of those passengers had ever been the founder of anything. That fact, more than any of the others, was the one she found herself unable to stop thinking about. That evening, on the flight home, he sat by the window in the seat that was actually his, watched the lights of the city fall away beneath the wing, and thought, not for the first time, that he had lost count of the number of times a stranger's assumption had tried to decide, before a single fact had been checked, who was allowed to sit where on an airline he had built with his own hands from 4 leased regional jets. It usually sorted itself out, it always had so far. If this story reached you, hit that like button, it helps more than you know. Drop your city in the comments, I want to see how far this story travels. And subscribe, because the next story is already waiting above the clouds.